Hello, welcome to another episode of The Convergence, where past and present combine, temporal and spiritual. Well, my name is Adam, and while I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, these opinions and ideas are my own. I encourage you to seek for truth by study and also by faith, temporally and spiritually. As the prophet, President Russell M. Nelson, once said, the Lord loves effort. So it does require spiritual and physical effort to learn, to grow, and to gain salvation and exaltation. So this episode is going to be hopefully an amazing one. I hope you'll enjoy it. It's going to be a little longer than my others because so many amazing things have happened in the past several weeks and months and even years. And it is episode 77, so I'm going to talk a lot about symbolism and meanings and things that are actually happening. It's going to be signs of 12 and signs of 7, and I'm going to attempt to explain how the prophet's very life is a sign and a wonder for heaven. His life, his ministry, and the time of his life. So, as you all know by now, President Nelson passed away on September 27th, 2025, shortly after 10 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, which would be shortly after midnight Eastern Daylight Time, if you look at it from the Eastern New York City perspective. And after that, the Quorum of the 12 was leading the church. And the first presidency is immediately dissolved as soon as the prophet or president passes away. So when he passed away, the Quorum of the 12 then began leading the church with the senior apostle at the head, which was President Oaks. And as President Oaks mentioned in the October 2025 General Conference, the church membership and everyone and all the leaders had already been sustaining him for the past 7 years, plus 7.5 years, more than 7.5 years, as the president of the Quorum of the 12. So I thought that was really interesting to kind of reflect on that we've already been sustaining him as that, and so now it's just taking effect when he dies, when President Nelson dies. So this picture, I think, is really symbolic and meaningful and instructive. This was the picture that they used when they announced in the newsroom.churchofjesuschrist.org that President Nelson was going to have a memorial service on October 1st. So here, first of all, you see the prophet front and center, and right behind him is Jesus in his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, right before he was crucified. And on President Nelson's right, you have Joseph Smith, and on President Nelson's left, you have his first wife, and then on his right, you have his second wife. So you see, it's kind of like Jesus is coming again. He's the bridegroom, and then he's getting his brides, the church. President Nelson represents the church, and then President Nelson has his two brides. And Joseph Smith restored the church. So you can look at this and see it. Kind of interesting symbolism. And you have books, you have Joseph Smith restored the books and the scriptures like Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. So even just in this one photo, you can see a lot of symbolism. Okay, so here's the news release, September 27th, 2025, remembering the life of President Nelson. Family and leaders remember him as a beloved physician. With sorrow, we announce that Russell M. Nelson, beloved president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, passed away peacefully shortly after 10 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time today at his home in Salt Lake City. He was 101, the oldest president in the history of the church. President Nelson was called on as an apostle on April 7th, 1984. He became the leader of the church on January 14th, 2018. His time as prophet will be forever remembered as one of global ministry. He visited 32 countries and U.S. territories. Increased temple construction, he announced 200 new temples, and profound change. Beginning in the April 2018 General Conference in which he was sustained as president of the church, the prophet began introducing frequent adjustments designed to help the saints minister more like Jesus Christ and better emphasize the centrality of the Savior of the world in all the church does. Later sections of this obituary provide a detailed accounting of his travels as president and the many changes he implemented. So I'm just going to, talk about this first two paragraphs of this news release and then mention some of the symbolism here. So he was 101. He had already completed his 100 years on the earth. He was the oldest president in the history of the church, and I will say the history of the restored church, because we have examples of like Adam in the Old Testament, who was a prophet, living, 929 years or something like that. And you have older prophets. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, so he lived longer than that. But in the modern day church, in the restored church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he's the oldest living president. So there's a history. April 7th is significant because it's the day after April 6th. April 6th was the day the church was reorganized in 1830. Many of us believe that is or could be the birth of Jesus Christ, the birth date, April 6th. From 1984 plus 40 years, 2024, he had served 40 years as being an apostle. And also, if you didn't know, President Nelson and President Oaks were called and set apart on the same day. Now, as the Lord says, my house is a house of order. The order of seniority of the apostles goes in the order in which they are called and set apart. So my understanding from the story, it was President Spencer W. Kimball, I believe, who was prophet at the time that these two apostles were called. And he was kind of in a state of, I don't know what you call it, but poor health, where he wasn't really conscious. And President Hinckley, I think, was one of his counselors at the time. And there was one apostle that died. President Kimball was still sort of incapacitated or whatever. And then a second apostle died. And then President Hinckley was like, okay, if Spencer W. Kimball, if President Kimball wakes up anytime, day or night, give me a call immediately. I need to ask him urgently who he wants to call to fill the vacancies in the Quorum of the 12, because now we have two of them. So the story goes that he woke up and became lucid, you might say, in early morning hours of, I don't remember which day, but anyway, it was 4 a.m. or something like that. They called President Hinckley. He went into him and he asked him, who do you want to call to fill the vacancies? And President Kimball is reported to have said, Nelson and Oaks, in that order. Russell M. Nelson and Dallin H. Oaks, who were both serving in their professional capacities. President Nelson was a surgeon and he had surgery scheduled. President Oaks was a judge. He was one of the Utah Supreme Court judges, and he had trials and things scheduled. And so they were called and accepted their calling, and then they were sustained in that order. So even the Lord back then, I think it was it says 1984. In 1984, the Lord knew the order of his apostles and who would be prophet first and second. So now I liken this to Isaiah chapter 8, verse 1 through 3 and 18. It says, the chapter heading for Isaiah 8 says, Christ will be a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. Seek the Lord, not muttering wizards. Turn to the law and to the testimony for guidance. Compare 2 Nephi 18. Verse 1, Moreover, the Lord said unto me, Take thee a roll, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Mahal-shalal-hash-bash. And I took unto me faithful witnesses to record, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah. And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Then said the Lord to me, Call his name Mahar-shalal-hash-bash. Verse 18, Behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel, from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. So I think this is really instructive, because basically, I never saw it until just now. I had always thought of it as the children, but it says I and the children. So I, meaning Isaiah, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel, from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. Mount Zion is like the temple. It is like the Holy of Holies. It is like the throne of God, something like that. Mount Zion, pure in heart, where all the holy angels dwell, the hosts of the Lord. So he's saying that the children that the Lord are giving me are for signs. And I will say for signs and seasons and wonders in heaven. So their names are wonders, their times are wonders. Also in verse 3, you notice it says the prophetess and she conceived. So you get this idea that the wife of the prophet Isaiah was considered a prophetess. And part of what she did was she bare children to be wonders and signs for heaven. So she gives forth signs through her children. Okay, so I contend that the same thing holds for President Nelson and probably all the prophets, but I'm just focusing on that because that's where we're at in time right now. So kind of to recap from the prior video, September 5th, 2025, the prophet publishes an article in Time magazine where he's calling for peacemakers, calling for us to be peacemakers and treating all kindly. And he issues this, and it was published at 1 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. I believe that's what it was. 11 a.m. Eastern. So it's like the 11th hour or 11 a.m. Well, maybe it says 1 p.m. MDT, Mountain Daylight Time. I think that's right. In Time magazine. So he's like, it's time. And he published it because he was turning 101. And I already went over that in my prior video, so I won't belabor that point too much. But on the very same day, September 5th, 2025, President Trump issued his 200th executive order restoring, quote, the Department of War, restoring the name Department of War for the Department of Defense. And later they say, oh, we did this to say we need to have a strong military so that we can enforce peace. And that's their way of looking at it. There's this saying that one of the former presidents of the U.S. used to say, I think it was Roosevelt or somebody like that, Theodore Roosevelt used to say, walk softly and carry a big stick. Walk softly meaning, don't raise people up to anger, but have a big stick to enforce the peace if people try to breach the peace. So you have this idea of peace and peace on September 5th from a spiritual president, President Nelson, and a temporal president, President Trump. This is where you can see spiritual and temporal combining, talking about war for peace and peace for war. 9/9, the prophet turns 101 on 2025. In D&C 101 is what we are studying that very week that he turns 101. And here's a little excerpt from it. And that lesson title of the week was called Be Still and Know That I Am God. There's this concept of hold your peace, peace be still, calming the troubled waters. Jesus did that on the Sea of Galilee. And then you have this painting of the saints being driven from Jackson County, Missouri. And you have this idea of violence coming in upon the saints as they're being driven out from Zion, what they thought was going to be Zion, which turned into not be Zion at the time. And then what happens the very next day, you have Charlie Kirk being shot at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. The peace is breached. And Christians and conservative political pundits and activists are being killed and attacked. And the very next day, September 11th, is the 24th anniversary of 9/11/2001 attacks on the USA. And then you have, 11 days later. Oh yeah, 11 days. You have an 11 sign. September 1st to September 11th, that's 11 days. It's like the 11th hour. It's the last time. And then you have 11 days more. Charlie Kirk Memorial Service was held in Arizona on the very, very same day as Elder Bednar dedicates the Hill Cumorah site at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Another sign of 11. 11 days after 9/11, 11 days after the start of September, and it's at 11 a.m. There's all these 11 signs being given. And 11, I think, can mean lots of things, but I think it's like the final warning. We call it the 11th hour. It's right before midnight, before judgment comes and before destruction comes and things like that. Then you have September 23rd, 2025, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, also known as, you also have this idea of the Feast of Trumpets with President Trump doing a royal feast in England at Windsor Castle on September 17th, I think it was, which I mentioned in my prior video. And then on the 23rd, President Trump speaks at the United Nations starting at around 9 a.m. Eastern Time, Israeli time, somewhere between 4 and 10 p.m. Around 6:36 p.m. sundown, Rosh Hashanah begins in Israel time, 6:36 p.m. Eastern time, and which is about 11:36 Eastern. Now I've got it mixed up. Okay, 6:36 p.m. Israeli time, sundown, and Eastern time in New York, it's 11:36 a.m. So Trump is speaking at in the 11th hour, around that time at the UN in New York. Meanwhile, it's the 6th hour sundown in Israel. So I view this, one way to look at this, as a sign of Trump warning the nations, trying to proclaim peace and telling them about this in his way. But it's kind of like a final warning to all the nations, and that's one way to look at it. So here's a little section from the Come Follow Me manual from September 8th through 14th, 2025. It says, discomfort soon turned into persecution and violence. In 1833, the church's printing office was destroyed and the saints were forced from their homes. So you have this persecution. And I kind of feel like September 10th, 2025, when Charlie Kirk was shot, is kind of a foreshadowing of Christian martyrs and Christians being persecuted. So that's one way to look at it. All right. So I think I'm going to pause here and do part 2. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Convergence, Signs of 12.